If you've wondered why your cortisol and your adrenal function are both off, it might be that the answer to your question can be discovered in as early as 1936. And in the course of this video, I'm going to explain the 1936 to 1940 discovery of Dr. Hans Selye, how this applied to the understanding of cortisol and adrenal function, and then we're going to jump forward about 100 years, because I want you, by the end of this video, to understand three crucial questions. The first question is, where are you along the spectrum of adrenal dysfunction? The next question is, how is it that you've been told by your doctor that your labs are normal, and yet you still feel crappy? And then the last question that I want to address is that how do you know if you're in a high cortisol or a low cortisol state? My name is Scott Resnick. I'm a conventionally trained medical doctor. I studied general surgery and gynecologic surgery, and I've been practicing functional medicine for about the last 15 years because I think this is the future of medicine. And I'm making these videos to take complex subjects and empower you guys to become best stewards of your own health care, to heal all aspects of your health without using conventional drugs. And in today's video, we're going to go back in time to 1936. Where Hans Selye was a Hungarian-Canadian medical doctor and researcher, and he was doing studies on mice and injecting them with different hormones. But what happens is that mice don't like to be injected with different hormones, so invariably when he opened the cages, he found that he was chasing these mice around their cages. And what he discovered was that the mice that were simply chased around the cages and the mice that were injected with different substances had a similar progression of dysfunction of their organs. And what he did is he coined something known as the general adaptation syndrome. Now, it should be noted that Dr. Hans Selye was nominated for a Nobel Prize something like 17 times, and the closest he came was second place. But nonetheless, these important discoveries have withstood the test of time. So in the general adaptation syndrome, he noticed that these mice were progressing through three distinctive stages as he chased them around the cages. And in this overlay that I'm showing you here, you can see that there were significant changes to the mouse physiology. Their adrenal glands were larger. Their lymph nodes were smaller, suggesting a lower functioning of the immune system. And I don't need to put into words what happened to their guts. Their gut health went down the tubes. So basically, the general adaptation syndrome showed that there were three different stages that these mice went through. And it turns out that we humans go through similar stages. So the first thing that happens is we go through an alarm stage. Now in this drawing here, you see that on the y-axis, I've written adaptation distress. So what happens is initially in the alarm stage, these animals kind of went along, and there was actually noted to be like a little dip in this alarm stage. And this was characterized by anxiety and high adrenal output, things like adrenaline being produced. So this was the alarm stage. After this, the animals all went into what is known as the adaptation stage. And what this did is it showed that there was an increased adaptation distress. And in many cases, it was noticed that these animals actually had normal levels of cortisol, as we will see in humans as well. But the thing is that this is a dangerous stage. So here they are adapting, because as the song says, what goes up must come down. And after a period of time, these animals, after sustaining a period of adaptation, went into a stage of exhaustion. And this is what Dr. Selye recognized as far back as 1940. So what I want to do is I want to now fast forward another 100 years, because it's my belief that cortisol dysfunction is really the scourge of all chronic disease. Not only is high cortisol secretion associated with things like diabetes, hypertension, autoimmunity, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's disease, gut dysfunction, but the other thing that happens is so many people in our modern industrialized world are running at such full tilt that many of us are here in this exhaustion stage. And unfortunately, modern medicine lacks the tools to make normal measurements, at least with conventionally trained doctors. So the first question that I want to answer is, why is it that you feel so crappy when your doctors have told you that they've measured your cortisol and that your cortisol is normal? This is both a true statement and a false statement, because indeed your cortisol may be normal, and most people have had what is known as a serum cortisol done at about 8 o'clock in the morning. The problem is that cortisol operates on what is known as an diurnal pattern. And a hormone which is secreted in a diurnal pattern changes over the course of the day. So it doesn't make sense to me that a doctor would be measuring a single solitary blood test done at, say, 8 o'clock in the morning when we know that the cortisol's pattern changes significantly over the course of the day. So I'm going to draw this out for you. What typically happens is that we get a normal rise of cortisol at something between, say, 4 to 6 o'clock in the morning. And then what happens is the cortisol tapers down over the course of the day. Now, the reason that our cortisol spikes in the middle of the night is that cortisol's primary job is not to get us away from a tiger, but it is to maintain our body's blood sugar. And it makes sense that if we were going to sleep when the sun set at, say, 6 o'clock at night, that by 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning, we've burned through the glucose in our bloodstream. We've worked through some of the glycogen that's stored in our muscles and our liver. And for this reason, we normally secreted cortisol to begin to break down our body to liberate the blood glucose that was keeping our brain alive. So this is a normal spike of cortisol that we see in the early hours of the morning. But the problem is that we're not able to measure this on a single serum blood test. And you'll notice that the range of your serum test is something like 5 to 15. Anything in there is considered normal. But as many of you will see once you've had an opportunity to do a 4-part salivary cortisol test, that when we get more information about our cortisol patterning over the course of the day, we can have a better idea of where we stand along this Hans-Selye's general adaptation progression. So what I want to do in this next drawing is begin to look at things from a different perspective. So what I'll draw here is a graph that shows cortisol or stress levels and stress on the left, and this is time on the bottom part of the graph. And what happens is the human animal is meant to have a stressor and then have an opportunity to go back to normal. Like maybe we survived a small period of not being able to find food. Maybe we engaged in a fight with a tiger. Maybe we fought with a neighboring tribe, but we aren't maintaining persistent levels of high cortisol. But what happens is in modern life, we start to compound these stressors on top of one another. And here we are kind of moving from this alarm stage into this adaptive stage of persistently high cortisol. And that can go on for a period of time. But then what happens is this is when we begin to see a further progression of our body's health with prolonged cortisol exposure. Because when you look at a 4-part salivary cortisol test, this may be the time where we see that the cortisol is elevated. And in many cases in this alarm stage, our DHEA is elevated as well. And I want to stress to all of you that if you're doing a 4-part salivary cortisol test, it is essential that you do it with the hormone DHEAS. And if you look at what is known as the steroid hormone cascade, you can see that there's a broad diversion. Now, sometimes this has been alluded to as the pregnenolone steal. But on one hand, we have the hormones which are anabolic and growth promoting. And these are things like testosterone, estrogen, and DHT and DHEA. And on the other side of the progression, almost like a binary split, we see cortisol and aldosterone. The cortisol side of the graph is breaking things down. It's breaking down tissues to keep us alive through the night and through maybe even weeks to months of low food intake. Conversely, when we have high levels of DHEAS, which is secreted exclusively by the adrenal glands, we start to build muscle. So what happens is during this adaptive stage, we can see elevated cortisol and DHEAS. But as I said earlier, what goes up must come down. So what happens is, I would call this kind of a phase 1 adrenal fatigue, where we're seeing cortisol and DHEAS go up. What happens is then we enter into what I like to refer to as sort of a phase 2 adrenal fatigue, where you can have high or normal cortisol, but what happens is your DHEAS begins to slide. And this is because as we maintain the stressors, we start moving away permanently from building muscles, from building tissues, from maintaining the strength of our bones and our immune system to one of pure preservation. So this is typically what we see in, say, like a phase 2 adrenal fatigue. And you'll know from these videos that I don't like the term adrenal fatigue because ultimately our adrenals really don't fatigue. But for the purpose of this lecture, we are using this convention. So now in phase 2, we have high or normal cortisol levels, but we start to see a slide in the DHEAS. And remember, DHEAS is secreted exclusively by the adrenal glands. But then as the progression continues, we see people start to move into the exhaustion stage. And this applied to the Celia's mice as well as humans. So when we get into a stage 3 adrenal fatigue, this is when we start to see our cortisol go down as well. Now this is when you start on a 4-part salivary cortisol test, starting to see that you're not able to raise up that early morning cortisol, that cortisol awakening response. So if your morning cortisol is low, if you are experiencing symptoms of fatigue and low energy, if you're feeling like you need to crawl off and find a place to nap in the middle of the day, if you go from 0 to 60 with anxiety, or if you find that you are needing to go sneak off to the break room to look for that box of Krispy Kreme donuts or cookies that you think that somebody brought to the office, you could be in a more advanced state of adrenal dysfunction. And that brings me up to the last question of how do you know what state of adrenal function or dysfunction you're in? And this is important to know because there are many characteristics of both the high cortisol state and the low cortisol state that are similar. Both high and low cortisol states can be associated with a degree of anxiety. The high cortisol state from just having high cortisol. But what happens is in this phase 3 of adrenal fatigue, when our cortisol starts to go down, remember I mentioned that cortisol's job is to raise our body's blood sugar, but we have a backup system in place for when things get really gnarly, and that is the secretion of adrenaline, which is epinephrine and norepinephrine. So if you're going from 0 to 60 and getting anxious in a heartbeat, if you're screaming at your kids and you wonder why, or if you're waking up at 3 to 4 o'clock in the morning, it's because your cortisol isn't rising naturally and you're relying on adrenaline or epinephrine to raise your body's blood sugar. And so what stage are you in? The best way to know what stage you're in is to obtain a 4-part salivary cortisol test. Because with the 4-part salivary cortisol test, you can see where you stand with this cortisol awakening response. If you're able to raise your cortisol to the stressor of doing nothing more than sleeping. Additionally, over the course of the day, you can see whether your cortisol levels tend towards the higher side or whether they're normal. Because remember, this is something that we can expect to see in a phase 2 adrenal fatigue. Remember, this is often associated with a normal or a declining DHEAS. And if you look at your 4-part salivary cortisol test and you see that your cortisol is low and your DHEAS is low, this is a more advanced phase of cortisol dysfunction. This is effectively equivalent to Hans Celia's mice in their exhaustion stage. So in this video, I've gone over the history of understanding what's happening with cortisol and as our adrenal function declines over time. We talked about the different progressions that are typically seen in modern humans, where we add these stressors on top of one another to a point that we're able to maintain that adaptive state for a while. But then, like what the song says, what goes up must come down. So I put together a simple little 5-question self-assessment that you can access in the description below. This is going to give you insight into where you stand from a functional perspective by asking yourself some really simple self-reflective questions in the privacy of your own home. You can develop a greater understanding of where you are along this spectrum of disease to health. And as always, I'm making these videos to empower each of you to become best stewards of your own healthcare. And if you want to know more about the relationship between cortisol and DHEAS, I'd recommend that you go to the video that's listed in the description below, or maybe even shown in this tab here on the side of the screen. And I will see you guys in another video. Take care.